Welcome to This Explainer. We're diving straight into a fascinating story today, the Silent Rot Lessons from the Radio Mogadishu Archive. Now, on the surface, you might think, okay, a story about saving old cassette tapes. But as we unpack the source material, it actually reveals this profoundly sobering reflection on what it really means to preserve a national identity. So let's just jump right in. To really wrap our heads around the weight of this, we've got to grasp the sheer extraordinary scale of this archive. I mean, we're talking about tens of thousands of individual recordings here. And these aren't just, dusty old news broadcasts. This archive contains the absolute bedrock of Somali culture. It holds decades of traditional music, poetry, pivotal political speeches, the evolution of the language itself, and really the collective memory of an entire people. The source material actually puts this beautifully. It describes this collection not just as a room full of old tapes, but literally as the soundtrack of a civilization. Just imagine the sheer cultural wealth sitting in that room.
So, when you hear about an archive like this being digitized, your mind probably races to the possibilities, right? And this is where it gets incredibly cool. Because why stop at just converting a tape to an MP3? Imagine transcribing every single recording. Imagine building these richly annotated datasets, complete with metadata that identifies the speakers, the historical dates, even specific regional dialects. We could see these released as open datasets on platforms like Hugging Face. We're talking about next-generation AI systems learning from authentic Somali voices. That ensures the Somali language becomes a core part of 21st century tech instead of just an afterthought. The potential to elevate this history is, frankly, just breathtaking.
But then, something kind of stops you in your tracks. If you watch the documentary on this monumental preservation effort, there's a large UNESCO banner just sitting quietly in the corner of the screen. And as the credits roll, a really stark reality comes to light. This entire massive project, it was funded by Japan. And that brings us to a deeply uncomfortable question posed by the source material. And I want you to really sit with this for a second. Why did it take Japan? Think about it. We're talking about a country with absolutely no shared language, no shared ethnicity or religion, literally no historical connection to Somalia whatsoever. Yet Japan and UNESCO recognized the critical urgency of preserving one of Somalia's greatest cultural treasures way before Somali institutions actually did. Now, obviously, they deserve immense praise for that generosity, for sure. But the fact that they had to step in at all, well, the author notes that raises a question far more painful than its answer. Because the uncomfortable truth here is that the decay of these vital archives isn't just about, bad humidity or a broken AC unit. These deteriorating tapes are the physical manifestation of decades of political failure. It's a tangible symptom of a society that has, time and time again, made the choice to prioritize political power and individual gain over building durable public institutions. When infrastructure rots to this degree, it's not a natural disaster. It is a structural choice.
So, how exactly did we get here? The source maps out a very clear, neutral trajectory of Somalia's political history to explain this, and it definitely doesn't happen overnight. It starts back in the 1960s. You have corruption and nepotism slowly infecting civilian politics. That instability drags the country downward into dictatorship. Then that dictatorship eventually fractures into complete state collapse, which gives way to warlordism, clan warfare, and this endless loop of zero-sum politics. It's a chain reaction spanning decades, where every single generation essentially inherits a society with slightly less institutional stability than the one before it.
And when a nation gets caught in that endless cycle, the toll is incredibly heavy. The author uses this powerful, repetitive rhythm to drive this point home. And it's vital we just listen to it for a moment. When power is chosen over institutions, archives do not survive that choice, libraries do not survive that choice, hospitals do not survive that choice, universities do not survive that choice, states do not survive that choice. It's a stark reminder, isn't it? Physical culture and societal safety nets are fragile. They require constant, deliberate protection. Now, this brings us to a highly sensitive term, the failed state. The source totally acknowledges that many Somalis understandably bristle at this description. But the author asks us to look at it not as an insult, but just as an objective observation. I mean, what else is the world supposed to call a country whose very archives require a foreign rescue mission? A country where hospitals rely on foreign aid, food security depends on international relief, and even national security is propped up by external partners. It's simply an impartial categorization of a state that can't perform its most foundational duties for its citizens anymore. But here is where the tragedy really deepens. Because the issue is absolutely not a lack of capable people. Actually, it's the exact opposite. The Somali diaspora is packed with immense individual talent.
You have brilliant Somali doctors, engineers, software developers, historians, and entrepreneurs thriving on literally every single continent on the globe. The tragedy is the contrast. This overwhelming wealth of human capital has repeatedly failed to translate into durable public institutions back home. So you have the brightest minds building functioning institutions everywhere else in the world, while at home, the roads crumble and the archives rot.
So, what's the actual bottleneck? Why can't all that incredible talent take root at home? Well, the source outlines three main systemic issues blocking progress. First, political loyalty is way too often measured by kinship rather than actual competence. Second, public office is frequently treated as private property, basically a tool for personal enrichment instead of public service. And third, achieving a political victory somehow matters more than the actual state of the nation left standing when the battle is over. When those behaviors become the norm, competence gets completely sidelined and the nation's survival is on the line.
Now, when foreign nations or organizations step in to fix these decaying institutions, it often sparks a lot of local outrage. People naturally ask, hey, why are foreigners touching our heritage? But the author points out a really bitter irony here. It is deeply ironic to express outrage at foreigners preserving your heritage, or feeding children during a famine, or funding schools, while showing far less outrage at the decades of internal neglect that made that intervention necessary in the first place. You see, the emergency isn't the intervention itself. The true emergency is the systemic failure that made the intervention indispensable.
Okay, but it's not all bleak. The good news from the source is that none of this means the situation is beyond recovery. Recovery is absolutely possible, but it comes with a strict prerequisite: honesty. A nation can't just endlessly blame colonialism or neighboring countries or global politics or even just bad luck. To actually rebuild, a society has to look inward. It has to confront its own repeated failures of governance, its lack of accountability, and its poor stewardship of public resources. Real recovery demands internal accountability first, period.
And this brings us to the author's core philosophy on how societies operate, and it's basically an undeniable law of nature. Nations harvest exactly what they cultivate. If you sow corruption, you simply cannot expect prosperity. If you sow nepotism, don't expect excellence. Sow division, don't expect unity. And if you sow institutional neglect, well, you definitely shouldn't expect your history to magically preserve itself. The author sums it up with this striking metaphor: you cannot sow thorn bushes and expect to harvest maize. As we wrap up this explainer, let's look back at the Radio Mogadishu archive. It becomes pretty clear that this is no longer just a quaint little story about saving old cassette tapes, is it? It's a flashing red warning sign. It serves as a massive, overarching lesson for any society, anywhere in the world. When we take our public institutions for granted, when we allow politics to just become this zero-sum game of self-interest, the very soundtrack of our civilization is put at risk of fading into absolute silence.
I want to leave you with this final, honestly pretty haunting thesis straight from the source text. A civilization rarely disappears all at once. It disappears one neglected institution at a time. It really makes you look around at the institutions in your own society, doesn't it? It challenges us to ask what exactly we are sowing and what institutions we might be quietly neglecting right now. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I hope it's given you a fresh perspective and leaves you eager to explore how we build and protect the institutions that hold our own histories together.